Now I would like to introduce our special guest today. There are few topics more likely to elicit strong, passionate, and even aggressive points of view than nuclear power. In a time when we are justifiably more aware of and concerned for our environment than ever before, nuclear power generation is one of the hottest of hot-button issues. And North American politicians have long treated the whole debate over its use as if it were, well, radioactive. They know that in the popular imagination, Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island are more than places on a map. They've become bywords for disaster. Partly because of this element of fear, and partly due to the relatively high cost of nuclear power compared to, say, coal generators or nuclear power development has been dying in North America for more than a decade. And it might still be dead were it not for the global warming and climate change issues. Here in Ontario, where, as we all know, there is an election on right now, the provincial government is planning to phase out the use of coal as a power source by 2014. Everyone agrees that it would be nice to get rid of coal plants with their dirty and dangerous emissions, but the key question is how to replace them. With the province facing a 25% increase in energy demand over the next 20 years, and a 30% increase in required power capacity, that shortfall will have to be addressed somehow. Alternative energy sources like wind and solar power and biofuels are only partial replacements. The shortfall will have to be made up, at least in part, by nuclear power generation. And that means we're likely looking at some pretty intense energy discussions over the next few years. Our guest today is no stranger to the nuclear power debate. He's conducted it from both sides. 3 decades back, Patrick Moore and a like-minded group of activists founded Greenpeace. Back then, his typical workday meant ripping around the high seas in a small boat, dodging whaling harpoons. And as far as nuclear power plants were concerned, Patrick Moore considered them, and I quote, the most dangerous devices that man has ever created. Today, Dr. Moore is an environmental consultant and a fierce advocate of sustainable development. And while he doesn't spend much time in close contact with whaling harpoons or the rudders of coal barges in Lake Ontario, he's still just as passionate about the causes he believes in, nuclear power being one of them. But his thinking on this issue has changed dramatically. He now describes nuclear as the energy source that can save our planet from catastrophic climate change. As Canada and many other nations focus on sustainable development, Dr. Moore recommends that we stop treating nuclear power as taboo. No doubt this isn't getting him many invites to Greenpeace barbecues anymore. Today, Dr. Moore is here to talk about what brought his dramatic conversion in thinking about nuclear power and to discuss its future as a sustainable energy source. He'll take our questions in a few minutes. So as you get your question cards ready, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our guest speaker, the Chair and Chief Scientist of Greenspirit Strategies, Dr. Patrick Moore.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Helen. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to speak to you about what has become, I suppose, without a doubt, the world's most important environmental issue, and that is climate change and energy, which are inextricably interrelated, but also today in many countries has become the most significant political issue, or at least among the top 3 or 5. First, let me give you a little background. I was doing my PhD in ecology at the University of British Columbia when I woke up to read a little story in the Vancouver Sun about a group of people who had started meeting in the Unitarian Church basement at Oak and Broadway, and they were meeting to try to figure out how to protest U.S. hydrogen bomb testing in Alaska. I wanted to do more than just read books about ecology and the environment. I'd become radicalized in the late 1960s and wanted to actually do something. I joined this group and ended up being in the planning meetings for the first voyage of what became Greenpeace. We sailed a leaky old boat across the North Pacific, provided a focal point for media attention to opposition to the nuclear tests, and helped change the course of history. When that H-bomb was set off at Amchitka Island in the Aleutians in November 1971, it was the last hydrogen bomb the United States ever detonated. There were more atomic tests after that, but President Nixon, at the height of the Cold War and the height of the Vietnam War, canceled the remaining tests in the series due to the overwhelming public opposition that we had helped generate in Canada and the United States. In retrospect, this was a major turning point in the global arms race. Flushed with victory, we decided to carry on. I ended up spending the next 15 years of my life after getting my PhD in ecology in the top committee of Greenpeace as we campaigned around the world. By the mid-'80s, we had grown from a church basement in Vancouver to a group with $100 million US a year in income and offices in 21 countries. Presidents and prime ministers were now talking about the environment on a daily basis, and a majority of people had come to agree with us that the environment must be taken into account in all our decisions. I felt our job had been largely accomplished, mass public awareness of the environment. And for me, it was time to make a change. I had been against at least 3 or 4 things every day of my life for 15 years. I decided I'd like to be in favor of something for a change, and made the transition from the politics of confrontation, basically telling people what they should stop doing, to the politics of trying to find consensus about what we should do instead. Because there is no escaping the fact that over 6 billion people wake up every morning on this planet with real needs for food, energy, and materials. Sustainability, which I believe is the next logical step after environmental activism, is about continuing to provide for those needs, maybe even getting some more food and energy for the people in the poorer countries, while at the same time reducing our negative environmental impacts. Now, a lot of activists today will tell you, no way, those things are mutually exclusive. Automatically, the more people there are and the more stuff they use, the more damage will be done to the environment. This is a myth, and one of the greatest myths of the environmental movement today. It is, in fact, perfectly possible to continue to gain the material and energy needs for the support of our civilization while constantly working to reduce our negative impacts on the environment. And there are 2 ways to do that. Number 1 is through changes in our behavior or our practices. Number 2, and possibly even more important, is through changes in our technology. A simple example. When you leave the room, you should turn off the light. This is a change in behavior. It's going to result in a 50, 60, 80% saving in the amount of electricity that room uses for light. Secondly, you swap out the incandescent for a compact fluorescent fixture. Now, even when you're in the room, you're only using 25% of the electricity you did before. Those 2 changes, one behavioral, the other technological, result in at least a 90% saving in energy in that room. And this applies across the board to all our behaviors and all our technologies. Getting more seriously, it means you drive a little less and buy a car that only uses half as much gasoline when you do drive it. It applies everywhere. I don't have long enough today to give you the full dog and pony energy climate change presentation that I usually do with full PowerPoint display, but I'm going to try and focus here on the climate change, nuclear, Ontario subject. We got a lot of things right back in Greenpeace. We did a lot of good work, and I'm very proud of having been part of the beginning of that organization and working with it for so long. But there was one big area that we just got wrong. And that was the fact that because we were so focused on nuclear weapons testing and the threat of all-out nuclear war, that we lumped nuclear energy in with nuclear weapons as if they were all part of the same Holocaust, all part of the same evil and destructive force. We made a mistake. We did not differentiate between the peaceful and beneficial uses of nuclear technology and the destructive and even evil uses of that same technology. Think of nuclear medicine. Who wants to ban that? Millions of people are successfully diagnosed and treated with radioactive isotopes, many of which are created in nuclear reactors. Then why would we on Earth ban nuclear energy when it is among the safest technologies we have in this world and produces large amounts of electricity reliably with no air pollution or greenhouse gas emissions in the electricity production side? That is the question I had to come to ask myself when I started thinking in the mid-90s about the subject of climate change and how we could move away from fossil fuels. Fossil fuels amount to 85% of all the energy used by our civilization worldwide today. Canada and the United States more or less reflect that same percentage. That's a lot of eggs in one fuel basket. How can we reduce that? That becomes the question. Well, why should we reduce fossil fuel consumption? There's more than one reason. Climate change, of course, is at the top of the list these days. Now, I am actually not a climate change alarmist. I have had the word catastrophe put in a quote of mine by the Washington Post when I didn't really want to say that, because I don't use the word catastrophe or disaster or chaos to describe the present trend in climate. Again, there's not enough time here to deal with the subject exhaustively, but even if we are part of what is happening to the climate in terms of global warming, it's not as if all the natural factors that have been operating to change the climate over the last many billions of years have suddenly disappeared and that we are the only agent of change. We may be part of it. Even if we are, the projections for how warm the climate will become are well within historical natural boundaries. A 2 to 5 degrees Celsius rise in global temperature would not actually put us into what have been the greenhouse ages for hundreds of millions of years over the Earth's history, when there was no ice at either pole and all the land was either tropical or subtropical. Life flourished through those ages, and all the species that exist on Earth today and or their progenitors must all have survived through those periods, otherwise they wouldn't be here now. But climate change and the potential negative risks are real. It's sort of like buying an insurance policy for your house. How many of you think your house is going to burn down anytime soon? But we all have fire insurance. Climate change is a very similar concept. We cannot prove what's going to happen to the climate in the future. But there are risks. So we should take out an insurance policy. The best insurance policy against negative impacts of increasing CO2 in the atmosphere from burning fossil fuels is to reduce the amount of CO2 we're putting there in the first place. That means reducing fossil fuel consumption. That's the number one reason for doing it. Number two is air pollution. People are dying from the exhaust from burning fossil fuels in transportation and energy production. Many thousands of people are dying, and many millions of people are negatively affected. It is, in fact, the biggest public health problem from any technology, the burning of fossil fuels for transportation and energy. That's a good reason to reduce fossil fuels too. Third, we are burning 300 million years worth of fossil fuel production in a few centuries. This is hardly a model of conservation. Future generations might like to have some fossil fuels for themselves. Fourth, there are higher and better uses for fossil fuels than just burning them off into the atmosphere, especially when there are alternative technologies. Higher and better uses such as making durable plastics that can be recycled, feedstock for industry, chemical feedstock, making fertilizers. And fifth, and certainly not least, is the geopolitical considerations, which don't apply so much in Canada because we have an abundance of fossil fuels and energy resources in general. But go south of the border or to a lot of other parts of the world, and we would find the politics of the Middle East, for example, to be considerably different if it wasn't for this absolute reliance on the substance oil, which comes from there. Those are 5 good reasons to reduce our fossil fuel consumption. How can we do that? A lot of people will tell you that we have to build a whole bunch more windmills and put a whole bunch of solar panels on our roofs, and that would solve the problem. Wind and solar, unfortunately, are both forms of renewable energy that are unreliable and intermittent in nature. It is not possible to provide base load power for the grid with wind and solar. Solar, in my estimation, is in fact out of the question. It's just simply too expensive. That's why Ontario has mandated the utilities to pay 42 cents a kilowatt hour for solar power from homes and office buildings. And still there's no rush for panels. Why? Because even at 42 cents, there is a loss. It is a net loss for people buying the panels. The solar people have replied by saying they want 85 cents a kilowatt hour to be mandated for solar power. That does not make any sense at all. It simply is not an option because it costs too much money. Maybe someday it will come down. Wind is less expensive. Still, it's a lot more expensive than conventional sources. But the problem with wind is that when you build a wind farm, that doesn't allow you to shut down a baseload power station because you have to back the wind up. Because when you have a peak load in the summer on a still day, the windmills aren't working. You've got to have something else in place. But when the wind is blowing when you need the power, it allows you to shut off some gas plants. That is why wind has an important role to play, because it does allow you to reduce CO2 emissions and fossil fuel consumption when the wind is blowing. And up to maybe 10% of our electrical supply, we can use wind. But there's still the other 90. Ontario is the first jurisdiction I know of in the world that has made a political pledge to phase out all its coal-fired power plants. Well, it was supposed to happen next year, but it can't happen next year because there's nothing to replace the coal. And the coal cannot be replaced by wind and solar because they are not baseload power. So we have to find another solution. Well, hydroelectric power would do the job because it is baseload. Unfortunately, Ontario has built out pretty much all of its hydro potential, so that is not available either. In Ontario, the options are two: gas and nuclear. The Clean Air Alliance, Ontario Clean Air Alliance, would like you to think that gas is the right option. In fact, although containing many well-meaning members, the Ontario Clean Air Alliance is basically a front for the natural gas lobby. They want to use gas, as they say on their homepage, as a transition fuel into the future. They don't say what we're going to be transitioning into in the future, but basically what they support is gas. That means what you have is an environmental movement in the form of Greenpeace and Pollution Probe, etc., who are all supporting the Ontario Clean Air Alliance. In other words, they would rather see gas and all the greenhouse gas that comes from it than nuclear. It's unfortunate that they have basically painted themselves into such a staunch anti-nuclear position that they would prefer to have a high CO2 emitting energy source that's going to double the electricity bills in this province because we're already using too much gas in North America. That's why we're starting to fight with the United States about where the big LNG plants are going to go between Nova Scotia and Maine, because we have to build LNG plants all around the perimeter of North America to satisfy the infrastructure that we've built over the last 20 years, mainly in natural gas generated electricity. And now, natural gas is too expensive to use for base load power, unless you're New York or California where they got a lot of money. But no one else can afford it anymore. And it is really the wrong decision for Ontario. Let me tell you what's going on a little bit around the world. The nuclear renaissance is a global phenomenon. There are two main policy drivers causing decision makers, utilities, political parties, etc., to move towards a decision to build nuclear energy in many countries. Finland is the classic example. People of Finland are most democratic, environmentally oriented, they love freedom and education and all good things. They had a long national discussion about what they should do to add energy to their system, because they need more energy. It came down to two choices: Russian gas or nuclear. They chose nuclear for two reasons. Number one, climate change. It became apparent to them that it would be impossible to meet their Kyoto objective, which is legally binding in the European Union. If they built gas plants, they could never do it. So that was a reason to make the nuclear decision. The second reason was Finland and Russia share a common border, have a long history, not always friendly. The Finnish people did not want to be blackmailed by Russian gas at some time in the future. So energy security was the second reason that they chose to build a nuclear plant, because they can get their uranium from Canada or Australia, who are not likely to be hostile. This is the two reasons that countries around the world are choosing nuclear energy. Climate change, in other words, fossil fuel, getting fossil fuel out and bringing nuclear in, and energy security. Sweden, another country that is pretty big on democracy and environment. The lowest CO2 per capita emissions of any country in Western Europe. Why? 50% nuclear, 50% hydro. No fossils in the mix. France, the second lowest CO2 per capita emitter in Europe. Why? 80% nuclear energy, very little fossil fuel. Denmark, with all its windmills, so famous for that, is the highest per capita CO2 emitter of any country in Western Europe. Why? Because even though 18% of their energy is coming from wind, the other 82% is all fossil fuel. It's flat, so there's no hydro dams. They are anti-nuclear, so they don't have any nuclear power plants. Not many people realize that it is the energy mix that you choose that determines your CO2 emissions per capita to a large extent. Look at Canada. The average for Canada is 20 tons of CO2 per person per year, about the same as the United States. Quebec is 13, all hydro. British Columbia is 14, nearly all hydro. Ontario is 16, 50% nuclear, 30% hydro. Saskatchewan is 55. Alberta, 67. That's because it's all coal and gas. There is no way that Ontario can shut down those coal plants until that power is replaced. There are only two ways to replace it: natural gas or nuclear. The natural gas option continues to put at least 2/3 or even 3/4 of the CO2 into the air per kilowatt hour that the coal plants produce. How is that clean air? Or maybe CO2 is not being included in the cleanliness index here. Nuclear energy is the only one that can do it without putting CO2 into the air. Let me talk about the three key issues around nuclear energy that concern people. The first is safety. There has never been a member of the public injured by the nuclear energy industry in Canada, United States, France, Britain, or any other Western country. 3 Mile Island scared everybody. No one was injured. Even though it was a serious mechanical failure, the containment structure that the engineers designed to keep the radiation inside if there was a meltdown worked, and the radiation did not escape. Large follow-up health studies have been done on all the people who lived around that plant. There is no evidence of harm of any sort, and that was the only bad accident that has ever happened in the nuclear industry in North America. No nuclear worker has ever died of a radiation-related accident in the history of the U.S. or Canadian nuclear programs. It is safer to work in a nuclear plant in the United States than it is to work in real estate or financial services. This, according to the U.S. Bureau of Labor. This is a fact. A study of 54,000 nuclear workers in the U.S. shows they have 20% less cancer and 30% less illness overall than the average member of the public. You would think a little bit of radiation every day was actually good for you. There are some people who believe that, but we could go into that in question period. Anyways, nuclear reactors are one of the safest industries we have, and they are definitely the safest energy technology we have today in the world. Nuclear waste. Unfortunate that it's called waste, because actually the spent nuclear fuel or used nuclear fuel that is removed from the reactor core after a couple of years still has 90% of the potential energy in it. The fission products build up and begin to make the reactor inefficient. That's why the rods are taken out. Those fission products can be separated from the uranium and plutonium that remains in the rods through a process called reprocessing or nuclear fuel recycling. They've been doing it for 30 years in Britain and France and Russia, and Japan has just opened a huge new facility for the manufacturing and recycling of nuclear fuel. We are 30 years behind here in North America, largely because of decisions made way back when during the Cold War that do not apply the same way any longer today. The used nuclear fuel should be securely and safely stored and guarded until such time as the technology is in place to recycle it to recover the very valuable energy resource that it contains. It is a precious future energy resource, not just a waste. There's a bit of waste in it. The interesting thing is that when you recycle it, you then take the long-lived isotopes, uranium and plutonium, and use them as fuel. The waste products, the fission products as they're called, actually the longest lived ones are only about 30-year half-life, which means 300 years, and it's basically harmless. We can easily store something underground in containers for 300 years. So don't listen to people who say it's 250,000 years. That's the plutonium. We can burn that as fuel and turn it into fission products too. Nuclear weapons proliferation is a very serious issue. We don't want these materials to get in the wrong hands. But it is important to note, and this is the mistake we made back in the old days, is saying that basically nuclear reactors are the same as nuclear weapons. You don't need a nuclear reactor to make a nuclear weapon. There was no nuclear reactor involved in the Hiroshima bomb. That was the Nagasaki bomb. It was a plutonium bomb. The Hiroshima bomb was a uranium bomb. All you need to do to make a uranium bomb is have uranium and centrifuges. It used to be much harder when gaseous diffusion was the method of enriching uranium. But the centrifuge technology is much simpler and cheaper. And that is what Iran has, and that's why everybody is worried about them. It's not just because of nuclear power, it's because of centrifuge technology. So you do not need to have a nuclear reactor to make a nuclear weapon. As a matter of fact, it's easier to make one without a nuclear reactor. Secondly, and even more general, you don't ban the beneficial uses of a technology just because it can be used for evil. Otherwise, we would never have harnessed fire. What is a car bomb made with? Diesel oil, fertilizer, and an automobile. Are we going to ban those three things so that people can't make car bombs? What is the single largest weapon of mass destruction in the last 20 years in this world? The simple machete. Over 1 million dead in combat with big knives. And yet, the machete is the most important tool for farmers in the developing world, for millions of them. They clear their land with it, they plant their crops with it, they cut their firewood with it, and they harvest their crops with it at the end. Nobody's going to be banning machetes anytime soon. The issue of whether we use technology for good or evil cannot be blamed on the technology. There are many technologies that can be used for evil and destructive purposes, but they are in many cases can be used for beneficial and peaceful purposes, and we should continue to do so. Should I conclude shortly?
That would be fine.
I'm not very good at keeping track of time, and I'm very long-winded. I just give you one example to highlight the dilemma we're in here, and it will help maybe you in Ontario to understand which way to go forward. Take France and Germany, side by side, sharing a common border, long history together. They know each other well, in good times and bad. In France, 80% of the electricity is being produced with nuclear power. They are building a new nuclear power plant right now. They are the only country in Western Europe with a surplus of electricity for export to other countries. Their energy policy is in line with climate change policy because their nuclear reactors are not producing CO2 or air pollution, and they have the second lowest CO2 emissions per capita in all of Europe. Right next door in Germany, under Chancellor Schroeder and the Social Democrats, a decision was taken to phase out all 27 nuclear power plants in Germany by 2020. At the same time, the new Chancellor Merkel has announced that Germany will reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 20% by the year 2020. These two policies are mutually exclusive, they are logically inconsistent, and cannot be accomplished simultaneously in any real world. Meanwhile, Germany is importing $3 billion worth of nuclear energy from France every year. And just before Chancellor Schroeder left office, of course, he got this moratorium in place and a phase-out in place so that all the nuclear plants are supposed to have to shut down in Germany. What is the only viable option other than dirty brown German coal, which is not really much of an option in the climate change time? The only real option is Russian gas. A few days after Schroeder stepped down from his position as Chancellor, he accepted the position from Gazprom, the Russian gas monopoly, as Western European representative. So he's going to sell the gas to Germany. That's the situation in the world today. I hope that Ontario has the fortitude to move forward with the decision that has been made to build new nuclear power plants here. You already get 50% of your electricity from nuclear and have done for a long time, 30% from hydro. An excellent energy mix for a climate change environment. And please encourage your politicians and people in your communities to understand the issue in the way I've hopefully explained it today. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Patrick. I'm going to ask you to stay right where you are and give you about 30 seconds to catch your breath before I start with the questions that have been submitted from our audience. That's okay, you're back now. And our first question of several. Governments need to get reelected. Supporting nuclear power right now is problematic. If nuclear is the answer, how do we get them to support it?
Well, the good news is that a majority of people in Ontario do support nuclear energy. This unfortunately isn't true in my home province of British Columbia. But you have more allies all the time. Alberta is actually moving forward with a proposal to build twin CANDU nuclear reactors at Whitecourt, and the population is very supportive. It's really interesting. I've been to Alberta in the community where this proposal is moving forward. They are just totally gung-ho, and they're not all caught up in the anti-nuclear rhetoric. Whereas if you proposed a nuclear plant in BC or Saskatchewan on either side, you'd probably have a revolution, at least at the beginning. Thankfully, you already have such a strong foothold in nuclear energy here. Most people in Ontario are familiar with the subject and know that the nuclear plants aren't hurting anybody. As a matter of fact, in polls, it is generally the case that the closer you get to a nuclear plant, the higher the public support for nuclear energy is, because they've lived with them for years and know they're not causing damage. There's another saying, the closer you get to a nuclear plant, the better the schools and roads are. That's because they are giant wealth-creating machines. And the people who work in them, 800 people in an average plant, are making 40% more than the average wage in communities. So they're contributing economically to the local environment. I think Ontario is ready for nuclear power. I think that the vociferous opposition is a very small minority these days. I don't think you're going to see people marching by the tens of thousands or parachuting into the construction zones like we did back in the good old days. I'm actually quite sorry that we did that, because we did parachute into Darlington, and we did stop that thing about 4 times or whatever it was and made it cost way more than it should have. And now they say that nuclear energy is too expensive, and it's really because of what we did. Nuclear energy is not too expensive. It is actually very cost effective, especially once you get it built. It then runs at a very reasonable price, and it is definitely the best choice, especially when you consider that the only alternative is natural gas.
Thank you. Our next question. If we move to nuclear energy, what will be the bottom line impact on global climate change?
For example, the 104 nuclear plants that are operating every day in the United States, if that power was produced by coal, it would be the equivalent of putting 100 million more cars on the road. We use a lot of energy, and energy is the second largest emitter of CO2 in the world after transportation. But here's a logical scenario, a likely scenario with technology that already exists. We build more nuclear. We replace the coal-fired power plants, and then build even more nuclear. Why? Because then we can run ground source heat pumps or geothermal technology in all our buildings, and out goes the gas. The natural gas industry isn't too keen on ground source heat pump technology because it's one-on-one, head-to-head. You put a ground source heat pump in your house, you get rid of the natural gas furnace, you get rid of the natural gas hot water heater, and you get rid of the conventional air conditioner with one unit. It's more expensive as a capital cost, in the same way that nuclear is more expensive than gas as a capital cost, but it's far less expensive on an operational basis. So there we have taken natural gas out of our homes and other buildings, in other words, out of our infrastructure. The second thing we do with the nuclear plants, where we don't really have to build more of them, because they run all night. And as a matter of fact, it's a problem to keep enough load on the grid, because it's not good to have no load and be running these big plants. The load should be all our cars. The plug-in hybrid is coming. The lithium-ion battery has been perfected, and the faster they roll that stuff out, the better. But it doesn't make sense to charge your cars on coal power. It does make sense to charge your cars on nuclear, wind, and hydro, because then there is no CO2 and no fossil fuel involved. So think of replacing our private transportation fleet with batteries charged with clean energy, changing our furnaces and hot water heaters into ground source heat pumps run on clean energy, And replacing the coal-fired power plants and hopefully some of the gas plants, the baseload ones at least, gas is great for peaking, with clean energy, and you have made a huge difference. We could meet Kyoto 6 times over if we simply embarked on that path. It wouldn't be that difficult, and it would be good for the economy. It would be good for the economy to retrofit millions of homes with geothermal. It would be good for the economy to build nuclear power plants, and good for the economy and the environment to have our private cars running on batteries charged with clean electricity. The heavy transport, trucks, planes, and trains in the future can run on the biofuel. That kind of cuts fossils out altogether, doesn't it? So why don't we go down that path? That would be my advice to anybody who's willing to listen. Because it's all available.
Now a question from one of our students. Nuclear power or not, how much of the damage we've done to the Earth can we reverse?
Well, actually we are reversing some of the damage we've done to the Earth already. It is no longer acceptable in the mining industry, for example, to just leave a big hole in the ground and a bunch of waste rock spewing acid into the environment. And in many cases we are cleaning up legacies that have been left from the past. Learning to be better gardeners of the earth is sort of what it's all about. We have to use the resources. We have to use the timber, and we have to use the energy, and we have to use the minerals in order to build our cities and feed ourselves. But we can do it in a more environmentally acceptable way. Learning to do our agriculture in the context of biodiversity. Learning to do our forestry in a sustainable way. There's so much talk about forestry being bad for the environment, it does drive me nuts. As a matter of fact, it's good to manage our forests because we should be growing more trees and using more wood. There's a whole bunch of areas where the mainstream movement has got it wrong, and that is certainly one of them. They're basically saying use less wood. It's the most abundant renewable material and energy resource in the world. If you don't use wood, you have to use steel, concrete, plastic, or fossil fuel to make things. So why wouldn't we use wood if we can do it sustainably? I just don't get it. Agriculture is another big area that we really need to focus on, because agriculture is actually our main impact on the environment. About 1/3 of the world's original forests have been cleared to grow monoculture crops to feed us. We need to do it. But wouldn't it be a good idea if we could learn to make those fields more productive so they produce more food per hectare and we didn't need to clear away as much forest? Many environmentalists want to go the opposite direction and turn all our agriculture back to so-called organic, where you basically dispense with most of the scientific progress that has been made in intensive agricultural productivity and therefore need a vast amount more land to grow the same amount of food. Where are you going to get more land? You have to cut down forests in order to do it. I'm working in Brazil right now in a classic situation. The Cerrado in central Brazil has become a breadbasket for soybean, rice, corn, and cotton and other crops. But they're clearing away native forest in order to establish these crops to feed the world. Where is the balance point? And how do you do agriculture in such a way that it doesn't just destroy the whole landscape, but rather leaves networks of biodiversity within it? The Brazilians actually have better land use policies than we do in many ways. 20% of every private property has to be set aside for nature in Brazil, including all streamside zones. When you fly over the Brazilian countryside, you see these networks like fingers, which are all the green belts that have been left along all the drainages. You don't see that when you fly across North America or Western Europe. And whereas we get through the media that the place is burning and all being destroyed and the Amazon's nearly gone, it's actually a beautiful country and they have very good laws and preservation regimes down there. But they also have to grow food to feed themselves. That's a very difficult question. I personally think that sustainability and the concept of sustainable development is going to take us a long way towards, as I said in the beginning, still getting what we need to survive, yet at the same time constantly working to reduce our negative impacts through changes in behavior and technology. I think that is the way to go. And hopefully, as the UN predicts, human population will level off somewhere around 9 billion in the middle of this century, and then will gradually begin to go down. Why? Because more and more countries are becoming urbanized. 300 million Chinese people are going to move into cities in the next 10 years off the land. When people move into cities, in particular the women become educated and empowered instead of being barefoot and pregnant all their lives. They have smaller families because in the country children are an asset for labor. In the city children are a liability because they're an expense. And so just like in Canada and Western Europe and the United States and all the other highly developed countries, families get smaller and our population is actually shrinking if it wasn't for immigration. And the whole world needs to become like that, and I believe it is going to. And thinkers like Stuart Brand, the founder of the Whole Earth Catalog, was once into the total back to the land mode like I was back then, now actually is saying that he believes cities are good because they get people off the land where they cause a huge amount of environmental destruction if they're spread over the whole place, and they put them in a smaller, more compact location where they get better educated and where they have smaller families. So that's a positive thing for the future. The other positive thing that's going on, poverty is actually the worst environmental problem in the world. If you don't think poor people can cause environmental damage, go to Guatemala or Bangladesh or Kenya, where people, all they have is a machete. 5 million people with machetes can damage the environment quite a bit, especially when they don't have enough money to reforest it after they've cut all the stuff down, especially when they don't have enough money to clean the water after they've made it dirty like we do. So we actually have quite a good environment here in Canada compared to what you see in a lot of countries where people are very poor because they just don't have the resources to look after their environment. And hopefully the trend today is for people to become wealthier. The United Nations says that by the end of this century, most people in the world will actually be at our standard of living. Then again, there's the doomsday thinkers who say within 50 years we're all going to be dead from climate change and Lord knows what else. I mean, I can't predict the future. But I do have a more positive outlook than the catastrophists. I really do think we're capable of doing good things and of learning from our mistakes and of moving forward with behavioral and technological changes that reduce our impact and help heal the earth.
Thank you very much. That's all the time we have for questions today, so I'll ask for a round of applause for Dr. Moore.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
And I'll now ask Canadian Club Board Director Chris May to come to the podium to thank Dr. Moore formally.
Dr. Moore, in listening to your remarks today, I'm reminded of a quote by the eminent physicist Albert Einstein. Talking about problem solving, Dr. Einstein said, and I quote, "Problems cannot be solved by the same level of thinking that created them." Our current energy supply problem is one that challenges not just Ontario, but Canada and also the world. And it's clear that finding a solution or solutions to this problem will require some very creative thinking. Dr. Moore, you have illustrated today that as part of this process, we'd be wise to examine some of our preoccupations about nuclear power. This re-examination of nuclear energy and energy in general may challenge us to use our imaginations more than ever before, to think our way forward in terms of long-term, sustainable energy supplies. Albert Einstein once said that imagination is more important than knowledge. It is the key to discovery. But imagination isn't enough. When we discover something new, shedding preconceptions and acting on these discoveries often takes courage and often meets with opposition. One thing is clear. When it comes to energy, the future cannot be guaranteed by our present power sources. That's just a fact. What isn't clear yet is the best way forward. Some came here today believing that nuclear power is an environmentally sustainable option that makes good sense. Others came believing that nuclear power is simply still too dangerous and expensive to dabble with. However we feel about the issue of nuclear power right now, I want to thank Dr. Moore for sharing his time and knowledge on this challenging subject. He has given us a lot to think about. So for that, and for your passion on this issue, and on behalf of the Canadian Club, I want to thank him for being with us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Dr. Moore, again, and thank you all for coming here today. This meeting is now adjourned.